Welcome to the next panel for Expo Day for SoulCon. And so today our panel is called Framing Life, Labor, Language, and Politics in Comics. And my name is Jennifer Caroccio Maldonado. I'm going to be your moderator. And so I'm coming from Rutgers University, Newark, with a PhD in American Studies, specifically in Latinx Studies and Comics. And I'm working on my first book project that is looking at trauma, history, and memory in Latinx graphic narratives. And so I'm really excited to moderate this panel today that is filled with creators who are making intriguing, complex, and stunning comic zines and visual artwork. And today we're going to discuss how they use the panels, colors, text, images to really give life to these graphic narratives. So my plan is I'm going to introduce you all, and then after that I'll have a question for each of you, and so we'll kind of like go down the line like that and then open it up to a larger conversation between all of us. So first up we have Christy C Rhode, who's a Cuban-American artist, writer, and musician who's been supplying creativity for punk rock, publishing, and social justice movements since she was a teenager in Miami, circa 1997. Rhode self-published Green Zine for 10 years and has since released 3 illustrated novels which tackle gender, sexuality, mental health, and cultural identity. Truthfully spoken with curse words and bathroom humor, her graphic narratives are Indestructible, Bad Habits, and Spit and Passion. And her recent project, The New World Tarot, is a traditionally illustrated tarot deck depicting resilience and revolution. And Nicky Rodriguez is a queer Puerto Rican artist educator making comics and zines in the Bay Area. Her autobio zines focus on the intersections of identity, including the struggles of being bilingual, as well as exploring and understanding queerness in regards to one's mental health. She explores the Spanish language through comics poetry and seeks to engage audiences in a conversation about involvement between culture and how we could tell those stories. Breena Nuñez is a cartoonist and educator based in the Bay Area who teaches comics classes at the through an ethnic studies lens. You can find their work in publications such as The New Yorker, Daily Shouts, and The Nib, as well as anthologies like Tales from La Vida and Drawing Power and Be Gay and Do Comics. And Sloane Leong is a mixed indigenous cartoonist, artist, and writer. She explores themes of survival, displacement, relationships, spirituality, identity, and mental illness through the genres of science fiction, horror, adventure, and slice of life. She's currently working on a second arc of her sci-fi adventure comic Prism Stalker, and has a new book coming out, which we're really excited to talk about from First Second, called A Map to the Sun. And finally, we have Ness Garza, who is born and raised and living in Riverside, California, and she's been creating autobiographical comics since 2015. Nothing in her life is off bounds. Her comics vary from working in an Amazon warehouse to mundane daily tasks like walking her dogs. And Ness is working towards a master's in comics at California College of the Arts. So I just also want to say to all our panelists and friends in the West Coast, thank you so much for being here. I know shit is crazy. So really, I just want to acknowledge that. Thank you. Yeah, so I want to start with Christy Rhode. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, and so your art, it's filled with these numerous references, both symbolic like barbed wires and mouths that are gagged, and specific events like the burning police car in your Brooklyn neighborhood recently. And so I would love if you can talk to us about how you incorporate both aspects of your own life and then also what's going on around you into your art and comics, and how does that art help you to tell those stories?
It's art and making a project with or about the issue, the experience, the thing I saw that traumatized me, has always just been my language. Like, I think even considering it as a job is something that happened when I was like 18 and kind of like, oh, gotta pick a college. And so I picked a college with an illustration program. And so, you know, because it was just kind of this thing that I'm like, oh, this is how I communicate stuff that's happening. And I like writing. I love writing. I write all my stories, and I write songs, and I'm a Gemini. I just try to do all the communication things. But like, I think that creating this whole narrative together with the art, and just, I don't know, it just kind of became this really important, inevitable way of processing super difficult stuff and fun stuff. Like, I think that I can show some of the art you were referencing too.
Yeah, please, if you want to share your screen, this would be a great time. Yes.
You mentioned the ball gag and the barbed wire, this is, I'll just scroll through the art. This is my most recent self-portrait, and then this is art for my band. And but this, for example, this drawing of this flaming cop car, this cop car on fire happened a couple blocks from my house, and this is just kind of where I run my errands every day, my regular life. And for this message and this really important action to take place so close to my house made me feel like it was this whole protection spell happening. And there's still protests going up and down my street pretty regularly. And, you know, stuff like that is just kind of what inspires me to make things and to do things. And then my most recent project, the Next World Tarot, is about, it started as a queer punk tarot deck, and then it just kind of evolved into these really important narratives about elevating the people who are on the furthest margins, the people who are being sucked over by the government the most, and by society the most, and just kind of, you know, just creating this oracle, I always called tarot cards therapy in a box. And yeah, just kind of like reinventing this tradition with these images that are people from my life. These are mostly my friends out of 78. It's all like people in my community. Some I don't talk to anymore. Some didn't want to be named. Some, you know, it's just very like this portrait of my life. Those you know, 2010 up until 2016, which were rough years. Like, I was so sad. I was such a mess. And you know, I think of the days where I would see these people, these you know, punks and people of color, queer people of color in my community. And those were the days where I would feel like, fuck yeah, I want to go keep making shit. You know, I'm sad, I'm hateful. Like, this has happened before. This has happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. And during this project, it was definitely about holding on to trauma and stuff like that I have already written about in my other graphic novels, Bad Habits and Spit and Passion, and which are just a totally different imagery. But yeah, it's like I've been writing about trauma and pain for so long that just kind of it's become my primary language as far as telling stories and processing dark stuff. Anyways, I tangent and ramble a lot when I talk too much, so please interrupt me or stop me. I think I've said enough. But yeah, like I kind of just feel like these personal narratives and political narratives are just this or art is just this inevitable way of communicating these things. And
I'm really interested if you can talk a little bit, especially since this is a creators panel, about particularly some of the imagery, like, you know, those really visual, like the barbed wire, things like that. Like, how do you decide, you know, is it the story that comes first, the narrative, or is it maybe a single item or image and then you create it from there? Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's usually the narrative, and I write stuff first. I'll write really long journal entries that will either be like an Instagram caption or be part of a novel eventually. And I just have, you know, and the more my hands hurt and my carpal tunnel syndrome and tendonitis, I use the notes on our iPhones. That's very helpful, and you can talk into them and talk your feelings into it. And so yeah, it's like I'll tell this, I'll be angry about something, and so the gag self-portrait came from this feeling of feeling so emotionally exhausted and constricted by you know, the government, society, and these larger things in the world, but then these very personal things that were almost exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So I loved this element of BDSM and this gag being pink and purple and fun. But then, you know, the whole, like, I don't know, I just get really different phases of being obsessed with communicating how, like, sexuality and feeling repressed with sexuality and wanting to, like, let go and be free and be, you know, like, honor my life and my body and all these things, and writing about them in a way that's not about my trauma. But then the trauma's always there. And so that was pissing me off too. And that influenced the drawing as well. And then, you know, it's always like the cop car, for example, it's always about contrast with my Gemini life. The cop car, for example, it was like, I needed something softer. I was like, yeah, this is amazing, and like this really important action, and I'm so inspired, but I'm also really angry, and I'm so tired of white supremacy just found, you know, funding and kind of like I don't know, being the foundation of so many institutions. And so I was angry. So then I wanted to add the herbs and all that stuff, these herbs and flowers and just kind of healing tools that are about you know, moving beyond the pain.
Yeah, and
And
it's almost as if like the nature's coming back, it's taking over. It's kind of yeah, thank you. So let's move on with Nikki. Hey. So your comics involve aspects like hiking, baking, quitting a shit job, sleep paralysis, which I love, by the way, because I also have it. So it was great to see that in comic form. So we'll talk later about that. And, you know, some of these scenes, they stretch out of the frames. And so I know in your next series, you're talking about doing, and you are in your next series doing comics in Spanish, Spanglish, English. And so can you talk about what you're doing, particularly when we're thinking about like the image and language and text, and how you're pairing it with two languages, English and Spanish, but then also a third, Spanglish. And how does language frame the narratives for you that you're creating?
Yeah. So like originally when I started making comics, I didn't know what I was going to make comics about. I feel like that was like my problem when I entered into the MFA program. Like I was really excited to finally figure out how to construct these narratives, like coming from an animation background, like just kind of like create a cohesive story. But I was still trying to figure out what I wanted those stories to be about, and kind of like being exposed to the world of like comic memoir and like zines, where a lot of things are like personal narratives by all these different creators, was really inspiring. So that definitely helped kind of put me on that track. But it wasn't until maybe the second year, one of my mentors in the program had suggested, or actually just commented that on the like graphic memoir I was making for my thesis, that he could visualize this in Spanish, like somehow, even though it was written entirely in English, like it flowed as if it were in Spanish, which I thought was interesting, just because for a while I kind of like found myself thinking more in Spanish the more I went to Puerto Rico, but it's just like, obviously I'm only ever speaking in English because I'm surrounded by English all the time. So it never really occurred to me to like intentionally make something in Spanish. Part of it was just like the lack of comfort of not being exposed to it on the regular anymore, because my parents stopped speaking Spanish when I was pretty young. And then also just the fact that like, because I speak it so infrequently, like it is not great. There are times where like my translations make no sense, especially when you're speaking Puerto Rican Spanish and it's already kind of like its own monster. So I was like, okay, fuck, like how do I do this? So it was like really hard to figure out, but that idea stuck with me for a long time. And just the more work that I started to make, that just ended up being much more abstracted and like poetic, especially as it related to like mental health, and specifically the duality of like being a Puerto Rican but being born in the States, and like experiencing everything that's happening in Puerto Rico through this like very distant lens of like how it affects my family, what I'm seeing on the news, and like what I can and can't do to like to assist them, really helped kind of drive the formulation of like, I'm just going to start creating these comics based on like whatever I'm thinking, because a lot of my zines are kind of what Christy was saying, just like, you know, shoving it in your notes app or like doing journal entries. Like that's pretty much how a lot of my zines start, and sometimes it just ends up being written in Spanish, and then I just kind of like break it all apart there, and it's like a giant puzzle piece of just like random things in Spanish and English that I kind of eventually pieced together into a comic. But as I got more comfortable doing that, like I really started to see most of my work living in kind of this like Spanglish space, just because with the more kind of like emotional work I was making, Spanish for me has always resonated as being like a very emotional, passionate language, and very figurative, especially when I think about like speaking with family and friends in Puerto Rico. There's just something very unique about Spanish where I feel like we're always kind of like talking around the thing, never directly about the thing we're talking about. But it's like, because of that nature, there's like all this like creative storytelling that just inherently happens. So whenever I like think or say something in Spanish, it's just like so much more vivid of an image. And when I like pair that together, I feel like it has more of an impact. Whereas like if I try to write something in English, it's bland. Like, I don't know. The words don't measure up to me sometimes, depending on the story I'm making. So it was like everything I'm doing, it's all experimental, basically.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. And I love too, because if we think about with images and text, they're kind of sometimes doing the work of creating those like visuals. But then when we're adding Spanish or Spanglish, you know, almost the language itself also has a visual aspect to it. So Breena, being half Salvadorian and half
exactly.
Guatemalan, huh? Oh, am I on? No, I'm not muted, right? Hey. So being half Salvadorian, half Guatemalan is a recurring subject throughout your comics and zines, which are filled with animated facial expressions, maps, food, books. Can you talk about how drawing your life in comic form has helped you process these complex ideas about identity and belonging, and how the process is reflected in your comics that address political issues around race, ethnicity, nationality, sexuality?
Yes. Wow. There's a lot to tackle and unpackage within that question. I think for me, I feel like I say comics is like, and I think everybody else has kind of been echoing this too, that it's a visual language. And going back to like early childhood, I didn't know how to speak English or Spanish at all until like I was 4 years old. And I sometimes like forget that this is kind of a common thing that a lot of our people experience, especially for those of us who are like first generation, born and raised in the US. Like we speak sometimes like either one language later on in life, i.e. like maybe like as late as 5 or 6. But I spoke like some kind of like jumbled mixture between Spanish and English when I was 4. Like that's when I started talking, but like I still didn't understand English enough to be really confident as like, I don't know, somebody who should be I don't know, well versed, knowing how to like do all my ABCs like way before like 4 years old. But I always credit my family for exposing me to comics, especially on my Guatemalan side. They read comics before they migrated to the US. Like my grandma read like Donald Duck in Spanish, my mom read Mafalda, and a bunch of other stuff too. So I think it's kind of been like this unspoken family tradition. And then I immediately gravitated to Garfield for one reason or another, which I realized it's because, well, he's like the only like non like white character I could kind of resonate with. And even when I wasn't able to like read that well as a kid, I just still kind of understood like what sort of like the narratives were happening in comic strips, because they have to do a lot of the acting. They're supporting the text, and I feel like this was a language I knew how to speak for a while, and to use comics as a way to like to document too, and to like express my feelings, because sometimes I realize I'm more of like a visual person rather than like a writer. But I feel like I'm feeling a bit more comfortable saying like, oh, I'm both this and that and a bunch of other things. But I feel like for me, comics can sometimes like be really inspired by poetry, and I really like poetry a lot. And I credit like certain people in my life who are poets and who are able to like create some kind of imagery with their words, with their literature. And I feel like I kind of want to see if I can do something like that, but in comic strip form. I feel like it's been the most digestible way for me, or accessible way for me actually, to say what I'm feeling. And why not, like what Nikki was saying, right, and draw stuff about what you're feeling, because that's something I also wish I could have seen. I really love like memoirs and like autobiocomics, but then I realized like, wait, I don't have a lot of like stuff by other like Black and brown people, like but I also don't do this enough for myself. So I feel like just kind of reflecting like, oh, why is this kind of like a thing where we don't see a lot of our narratives like written in memoir enough, or like occupying spaces like on a bookshelf or whatever. So I feel like it's almost like a social obligation. Like, I mean, as much as I love reading this stuff, I feel like it's time to hanker down at the drawing board and do this.
Thank you. Yeah, and can you just talk a little bit more, kind of when you're either, if it's autobiographical or fictional, just kind of starting with an idea, and then is it like politics first of like, I want to do this message, or you're kind of creating the story and you're seeing what that kind of message is as you're creating. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it'll always be politics first, since I think the personal, like what we were saying before, the personal, it does become political. I definitely see, at least for myself, like my identity, the way my body's perceived in the US is going to be politicized, like no matter what, especially in this empire for the longest time. And I think it just comes intuitively. It mostly comes from like a personal place, and I think whether or not it becomes political, I think it just depends on like who's reading it. But I think about just mostly writing for the person, again, who really wanted to read stories that had characters, nuances of existing as like this person of color living in the US from a like cultural family in a comic, because again, it was so lacking like during the 90s, and yes, and obviously prior to that. But I think it always comes from like more of like a diary kind of like process. I just think about what I want to write or create, and what I'm feeling like a certain day. And there's like a bunch of stuff I still haven't like shared, because I'm just like kind of waiting for like the ideas to kind of marinate, and when I feel like I've gotten enough sleep, I feel like that's when I'm able to like, okay, like I'm ready to revisit this thing. So let's get back to this idea. And I think what I also create is just kind of seeing, or it's more of like a reaction to the lack of visibility, specifically for Central Americans. I mean, it's still happening today. Even in the news, the rhetoric doesn't really focus a lot on specifically where do these people come from. And yeah, it becomes more of like a reaction. But at the end of the day, I think it's all politicized.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And kind of almost like staking a space out, right? Like, I'm going to claim this page, I'm going to claim this space. Absolutely. Up next, Sloane. I was really drawn to how vibrant the colors are through particularly the hues, like the pinks, purples, yellows in your comic art. And with your YA graphic novel, A Map to the Sun, it follows these 5 girls basketball players. And, I saw what you did was with the perspective, they're illustrated in very distinct color schemes. So you can kind of see each player, like, by the colors, this is their perspective. And so can you talk about how you use color to reflect mood and meaning in your graphic narratives?
Yeah, totally. So I'd say my color palette choices are kind of culturally inspired by like my Mexican heritage, and also like growing up in Hawaii, my Hawaiian heritage. Everything's very bright, neon, vibrant, both like our traditional folk art and also just our environment. So like Hawaii, the sunsets there, like a trillion colors, everything is just like a phantasm of color. So that's a huge inspiration for me. With maps, I initially wasn't going to do it as a non-literal color palette. I was going to go for something more subdued, but my publisher wanted it more wild, like my sci-fi stuff. So yeah, that was an interesting process, because after like 100 pages, I had used a lot of palettes and I was like, oh no, I need to come up with more palettes. So a lot of it was very experimental, just messing with colors, smudging it around, seeing what worked, and what it added to the mood and atmosphere, which was like sometimes a surprise. Like there's a dream sequence that's like cream and burgundy and brown, which isn't normally the colors I'd go for, but it added a really interesting kind of like quiet but like foreboding tone to this dream sequence. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm kind of into it. And yeah, what else? The gutters of the pages, that's the only thing I did like very purposely for the reader, which is the gutters change colors for each scene. And that was to help with more like for people who aren't totally literate with comics. A lot of my family and like smaller cousins, they have no history with comics, don't know how to read them, and find them very intimidating to start reading. So that was just kind of like a legibility thing. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that color can do that isn't immediately apparent, like with our own understanding of color. So I tried to take a lot of risks with the palettes I used.
Thank you. Yeah, and you mentioned the gutter. Can you tell us a little bit of how you as an artist use it? I love the fact that you said to make it more accessible to people who aren't super literate of like how comics work, that you use that as a way to kind of bring them in and to help like navigate and teach them. Can you say a bit more about either in Map to the Sun or some of your other work, particularly how you use the gutter?
I don't think I do anything especially unique with them. I think in Prism Stalker, they're way more minimal, whereas I tried to add a lot more space with my gutters and maps, just to give it, I don't know, my paneling in maps is way more subdued and minimal than Prism Stalker, which is like me just going ham and having fun. So yeah, nothing too special there.
Thank you. So Ness, Amazon has been in the news more and more, and your comics have chronicled your time working in an Amazon warehouse during COVID. Labor issues come up in your comics, and it's great to see it from the perspective of a warehouse worker. And so I'm interested in how do comics, particularly graphic memoirs, engage questions of physical and mental health in the workplace?
So like how do comics help?
Or just in terms of the narrative, when you're kind of creating the story and like who you want to focus on from that perspective. And so I know it's both, particularly with labor issues, it's you know, a lot of times it kind of gets focused on like the physical toll, particularly on workers, but then also there's a mental health aspect as well that I see that you're definitely engaging with. So if you can kind of you know, talk about how you either use the images, the text, the colors, the gutter, all those things, you know, as a creator, when you want to, you know, incorporate those issues into your narratives.
Right. Okay. Well, I started comics when I was working at Amazon, and it helped me stay alive. It helped me stay alive in the warehouse because it was like doing a daily diary is like, even if something bad happened in the warehouse, it's like, I guess this is something I could write about, because otherwise, what would I write about? And it just like made me like, oh, look forward to the next day. And those were my first comics that I had that people haven't really seen unless they're like really scrolling down through Instagram to the very beginning of my stuff. And I think it's incredibly, it's so important because like people can do manual labor. It's horrible, but like you can, I did it for a very long time. I'd put my body through, like I will never get my back back. I'll never get my feet back. But people know that. But what they don't know is like the mental toll of being in a place that does look similar to a prison. You're in a cinder block room and you don't get to talk to anyone, and you're just like working and not there. For an example, in Amazon, there's a spot called the cage by the workers. We call it the cage. It's called the HRV. It's like high value items. And you would get to go in there if you like, they looked at your background or whatever. And it was an easier place to work because you're not walking 15 miles because it's a small area, but you were in a cage, like a cage with people, and you're stuck in there, and like everyone's trying to make rate and they're going fast. And I was in the cage for a year, and I asked them, please take me out. I cannot I was crying every day getting these items, and they would take me out for maybe an hour and put me back in. And like the mental toll that was, physically, it was fine. I wasn't walking as much. I got to get rings and watches, but mentally it's scarring. And like I put that in my comics early on. And now that I have recently covered just what COVID was for a day, which is just like, this is just, but I would like to revisit those old comics now that I'm like removed a little bit from the trauma of being in a warehouse, and just like re-talk about those issues and like how much these jobs actually, like, it's not just a body thing. You're just in a mental cage in there. That's it.
Thank you, yeah, for sharing that. It just sounds horrifying. I'm so sorry. But yeah, and it seems also this idea, you know, whether we want to or not, kind of coming back to either trauma in our lives and how, you know, comics has been a way to kind of process that or come back to it. I'm definitely seeing through what all of you have shared. And so I just want to say, as like a reader of comics, I'm, you know, thank you for sharing that with us as readers, and like, you know, kind of displaying that kind of vulnerability on the page. So I have a few more questions, and I really just want to open this up now to all the panelists, and please feel free if you want to ask questions of each other, please, absolutely, because I really want this now to be a conversation. And so the other thing too is I want to leave time for Q&As from the audience. So if it's possible, our Wizard of Oz moderator, if you can start releasing some of the questions, and so then in the last 15 minutes, I'll start getting to those. So thank you. Particularly comics use these frames or panels that they enclose the scene, with either the narration, the text bubble, the colors, the action. And so I want to, I'm interested if you can talk about your choices, particularly why do you either decide to draw within the frames or outside of it, or you kind of switch? And can you just talk about, as a creator, how you do that, or the behind those decisions? Because these scenes are encapsulated in these boxes and these panels, but we know as creators you're making these very distinct decisions, these very purposeful decisions to go outside the line. So if you can talk more about that.
Do you mean that metaphorically or literally?
Honestly, both. I think physically, where we see I'm always interested when artists are kind of subverting the artistic norms. So we're usually, comics traditionally are within these nice little boxes. But with a lot of your work, I'm seeing all of you're being like, fuck that, no, I'm going to draw outside. We're going to have it spill over because life is messy. Life is, not in these nice little boxes. And I think it's also this very on the nose metaphor for identity, not being able to fit into those boxes as well.
Hi, I personally feel almost like constricted by the traditional format, even though when I read comics and I see somebody who can do like 5 pages of 2 people talking and make it interesting, like that's so awesome. I can't do that. I will do like a 2-page spread with like the 2 people talking in a mountain with like all these things, and maybe there's things like, it'll be like all the information will be there, but it'll just be a different visual layout. But even I think as far as it's, I don't know, and then it's like telling the actual stories for me is kind of I guess thematically it's outside of the box, but I think I grew up with so much Disney that like I want to talk about these difficult things. I want to talk about, racism in the Latinx community, or Cuban Americans specifically growing up in Miami. And I want to talk about dealing with sexual trauma, which one of my books and a lot of my zines is about. And I write about all that stuff because it's like, I know that when I read other people write about that stuff, it inspired me to survive and to give a shit about my life. So then just telling my stories, I'll write them because it's interesting and it's funny and this is a Lifetime movie. But then, like people receive it as this inspirational different narrative. But the way that I write the story is like, to me, it feels like so normal and down to earth, but it's never really been welcomed by the industry. A lot of, obviously I've been published and I've been, but it was, Span Passion, for example, I guess I'll just talk about really quick, that which Feminist Press published, but it's all about discovering Green Day and East Bay punk and queer punk, but then also about being Cuban American, and then also about not really even identifying as lesbian, but like being confused about gender, about attraction, about all these things, and then mixing that all up into the whole concept of womanhood in Cuban American tradition. And then, there's too much going on. And so no one wanted to buy it because it was too intersectional. And so I needed to taper down my intersections and focus on an intersection. And it's funny because now I'm older and now I'm like, I want to write all the books that were recommended. One was like, each chapter will be a Green Day song on Dookie. And like, I want to do that now, and then the other one was like, what if it was just about your family? And I'm just like, I'm not even saying half the shit, but I'm like keeping it real. Like, that's what I thought. I was being so normal and so down to earth by like even censoring a little bit of the things, because I wanted the story to be about like staying in the closet, and why holding on to my culture was as important as holding on to my queerness. And a lot of people are like, run away, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, no, I gotta, like, I've gotta stay here con la familia, and like el amor that I grew up with that allowed me to survive. So, but it's like, how can I write a story about, like, you know, embracing that while being like, all right, you're being homophobic now, it's Thanksgiving, I'm gonna go in my room and listen to punk and ignore you. And that's what the book was about. So nobody wanted to deal with that. It was like, it wasn't like linear queer, there's no girlfriend, you never, you know, the mom never embraces, like, hugs gets the sticker that's like, I'm proud of my gay child. She did now though, everyone's down now, but like, yeah, I wanted to tell this tragic, weird story, which I always think is important, which I think in the, as far as the industry goes, that is thinking outside the box. But to me, it's just telling my boring story of, you know, it just happens to be intersectional and outside of the boxes.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to shout out Christy, like those comics, especially the ones where you talk about your sexuality, and being a fan of Green Day too, as like a Green Day fan, I like really, really appreciate that, because it made me feel a little less alone. And I think that's also speaking to what you were just saying sometimes, and what Ness was saying too, how comics sometimes like saves our lives. Like, these narratives are so important, and it just reminds me like why I'm in this as well, to like take up space and to like make people feel safe to be a reader or to be like a part of this experience, because sometimes I think people don't feel like they can enjoy comics, especially since it's been such a cishet normative, heteronormative like thingamajiggy, right? Like I get really excited about this time that we're living in right now. But even before, like, seeing your stuff and like other folks of color's works, it just reminds me like, damn, like we've been taking up space, but with the internet, I feel like, oh, shit, there's a bunch more of us out here.
It used to feel like this small, like, you know, and even coming from the punk scene, it was even smaller. It felt like this, we're looking for each other and we're making art for each other. And then we all have, you know, our jobs and our under the table work, and, you know, we don't pay taxes, but we somehow get to Xerox all of our zines and like not pay for them. And then, but everything pays for itself. And so that's just been my art making practice for so long. And it was so much about like support and community and like holding each other. But then when you grow and you get out of that, and then the internet happens, and then you get old and you're just like this old artist with her cat that doesn't have the punk scene anymore. And like, it's just like, it becomes real disenchanting. But then seeing all these new, I'm discovering your work, honestly, you know, like, and just like seeing, oh, we're in community all of a sudden, like we're doing events together and our books are on the same tables at the conferences, and like, you know, the niche table with the POC and the queer, and like, you know, but it's always the good table. But yeah, it's like, it's really important to always remember that like everything we put out into the world, like, creates this, ripple effect of people wanting to tell their story or connect or heal.
That was just like so well said, and it just makes me think, like, kind of like going back to the original question about paneling. Like, when I think of how I use panels, like, I feel like my entryway into comics was originally like Capes comics and stuff, so it's like, you know, very traditional, and sometimes they're used more as like a narrative device as opposed to just like a literal like bounding box. But I've always really enjoyed stories where it becomes part of like the diegesis, kind of like sounds in a film or something like that, where it's just like it's integrated in there, and like the panel is like maybe a shadow of a character, or like the window that a character is walking out of, like things like that, where it's like really kind of more metaphorical as opposed to like, we're just making this a box that we're going to house the interactions in. And over time, I've come to like really stay away from paneling, or like just have like paneling doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I tend to like just leave things floating or like utilize the page as a panel and just have everything flow through that page. Just because like when I think about the stories I'm telling, especially like thinking about it from like a Puerto Rican perspective, the perspective of like a Puerto Rican diaspora person, someone who's like figuring out how to navigate between the two languages, it's just like whenever I am in Puerto Rico, like telling stories or like having conversations with my family, I feel like kind of what I mentioned before, how we like talk around things and everything's like very figurative. And I feel like there's like so many extensions and tangents of the story that suddenly become like discovered as you're trying to get to the actual point of the story. And I try to incorporate that essence into how I try to construct my stories, in the sense of like leaving them all kind of like a lot more flowy and separate from specific panels, or like sometimes I'll just have it where you can honestly read things multiple different ways without like a huge change in impact. Like it's not necessarily like a choose your own adventure where like if you read it one way suddenly it's a different story, but it's like you get to sit in like a specific emotion or moment like a little bit differently for a different period of time as you move through the page. And that for me has always been really just like a super immersive experience, and that's something that I would get little snippets of in different comics that I would read, and that I just wanted to make more of, especially because for me it just really related to like the different ways in which different cultures tell stories, especially visually. Like every time I pick up a comic, especially it ends up being like mostly like a memoir comic where it's like from a different cultural perspective, it's like you could see how that influences the way in which we're visually telling our stories. And again, it's just like thinking about the mainstream like media norms. It's like so restrictive for the stories we're trying to tell sometimes that it's like, honestly, you might as well just like say fuck it and then like not do it and like do it your own way.
Ness, Sloane, do you anything to add or kind of also to what some of what Breena, Christy, and Nikki were saying as well?
Yeah, it really resonated with me, and Christine said about like I feel like I'm just writing my boring life, or I'm just like writing about my life. It's so thinking about that question of like out of bounds, or out of what the question that you originally asked. Like I feel so restricted with my work as far as like out of the box, because I post everything on Instagram so that it's accessible and free. So I'm very like, the square is ruining my life as a comic artist, but also I understand
my life.
also it's like I understand that people that are not comic readers are getting into this internet comics, and they're fast and easy, and they're not necessarily looking for a narrative, more of like a visual communication. Or comics a bit, they're more of a visual communication than like narrative story comic telling, and it's like accessible to read, but as a creator, I hate Instagram. I hate squares. And then also when I think about my work as like as an idea going out of the box, is like I think that my life is so boring and so average that like it's I think that like Amazon and all this warehouse stuff is just like, in the IE everyone works warehouse, so like if I told these stories to my friends, they'd be like, okay, cool, we've all experienced that, that's fine. So it's nice to know that like, oh man, I just like want to encourage like everyone to just draw a week and see what you find about yourself, that like, oh, I didn't think that this was interesting about me, but like, well, that's so strange, I put one sock on and then my shoe, just like things like this that make people like very unique and special, that like if you're not doing a daily diary of any sort, you're like, it's passing you by, like even if it's just it's nice to know, oh, I'm boring and that's interesting to someone.
Yeah, all I can think of particularly is thinking with labor rights and how your comics kind of give readers who aren't familiar with what it's like to be a warehouse worker in Amazon, you know, kind of gives us a little bit of a glimpse into that. And I feel like that can be powerful and like so politically powerful, especially when we're seeing, you know, across the board in a lot of different places that people are, you know, workers were fed up. We're like, no, you need to pay us more. Like, fuck you, pay us, give us benefits and stuff. So I think, you know, those kind of little boring snippets are just really great for kind of providing that fodder. But I do get like, you know, sometimes you're like, why is someone going to be interested in this? But like we are. Sloane, was there anything you wanted to add in terms of like thinking about panels or kind of going beyond them or through them?
I feel like I'm probably just going to be echoing everyone else. They had really good answers, so I'll pass.
Okay. Yeah, so one more, for me, I just have one more question. And actually, you know, maybe I don't want to pick on you, but Sloane, maybe you can start us off with this, is, you know, how we can't disentangle politics from art. And I think people who say, you know, there's art that's not political, that's just bad art then. So we're going to put that aside. But there's sometimes a very obvious, you know, political message, and then sometimes it's a bit more subtle. You don't want to kind of bang the reader over the head. So can you talk about, you know, as a comic creator, when you're addressing and engaging issues of race, gender, sexuality, labor, when and where in the narrative do you want to make those artistic decisions to be subtle or to be explicit?
I mean, I feel like you were saying, people who think art is not political, that's just because the art is serving the status quo. So anything that goes against that is going to be like controversial, you know. For me, I mean, it's so just infused within my work, like non-normative traditions, like indigenous perspectives. These are all things that are not normal in mainstream media. So they're going to be maybe strange to a reader that's not used to them, controversial, political, whatever. I don't know. I don't really worry that much about like potential readers, because I can't like solve for what their perspectives are and their identities. So what I'm trying to do when I'm introducing controversial or like sensitive topics, like in maps, there's like racism, there's a teacher-student relationship, a very predatory one. There's teens smoking, which people are not happy about. There's self-harm, there's parental abuse. These are all very touchy subjects. There's non-normative relationships between a lot of the characters. And to me, I'm just trying to follow the truth of the story and the truth of my own experience. And I'm not necessarily worried about like, kind of like sanding the hard edges of those topics down for people to consume. And I don't know, I wish people would also be more bold in how they presented these more controversial topics. I feel like right now the atmosphere is like not very generous in how they read these sort of stories, but I don't know, I feel like there's value in being able to look directly in the face of these topics that are super present, but also like not spoken about because they're like distasteful or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What do y'all think?
I was just gonna say, like, I think, yeah, like art is always political, especially when you're thinking about comics made by like quote unquote the minority or like the indie scene, because it's like in creating our stories, whatever those stories may be, in all honesty, it's like we're constantly engaged in this active resistance against like what these main narratives are that are being pushed out there, or what these constructive narratives are of what our experience are. Just because like when I think about my work, like I'm always thinking about kind of like what Sloane said, like I'm not specifically focusing on like what white kid is not going to like the story or not relate to it or something like that, because that doesn't mean anything to me. It's like what's important is like I am getting this story out for me primarily, but also because I know there's going to be at least one other person out there who's going to relate to this on some level. And it's like someone can relate to everything you're talking about or just one thing, but at least they're being seen and represented in a way that like hasn't happened. Like anytime I'm at a zine fest, so many people come up to me because they're like, you have a comic on being asexual. Like no one talks about that. Or if they do talk about it, it's like a footnote and like a greater thing about like the queer spectrum. And they're like, it's great to see like these things out there, but it's like, it's also nice when you can have that specific piece to latch onto. And it's just like, when you think about, especially in memoir comics, like what is political, sometimes just existing is political. Like being a queer Puerto Rican, stateside Puerto Rican woman means that like no matter what, there's going to be at least one person who's trying to like deny or challenge any or all parts of me. And like there are other individuals that have to deal with more than that based on like the color of their skin and things like that. So it's like anytime you're talking about yourself, even if you think it's not explicitly political, the fact that it's about your identity and coming from you already makes it political, because someone's going to pick that up and really enjoy it, but then another person's going to be like, why does this exist? Because this isn't my experience. Because there are plenty of times at Zine Fest where like, it's always a dude will come up to me and say like, this isn't about me, or like, oh, I don't do this thing and X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, then put it down because it's not for you. And it's like, it's so easy to just like not have that engagement, but it consistently happens. But it's also great when those more positive engagement happens, where like people actually like become inspired to like great work, or just even talk about it, like do like a little review, because they're just like, wow, I finally feel seen and this is great. So it's like, even if you're not being intentional about it, like, oh, this is going to be political, it's like, no matter what, if your experience is not the mainstream normative experience that is like being put out there constantly, then it's political and people are going to latch onto that.
I agree with everything everyone said, and I just wanted to throw out there, because I think I've talked a lot about just the general issue of how intersectionality and kind of is in the way of capitalism in a lot of people's eyes, or you know, and as far as you know, what gets funded and you know, what stories get funded. And so I think I just am feeling emotional and exhausted lately. We all deserve spa time, meditation, and love, because just with the climate in the world, and then I see how it's exciting that a lot of people are becoming politicized, or like actually bringing stuff up that they've never talked about in their life, or actually listening to us after they've made fun of us for most of our careers. So it's like, even though it's exciting to see collective consciousness, I'm so exhausted and so annoyed and so like, oh, now, you know, so-and-so, Taylor Swift or somebody like that can say this thing and it's so cool. And then when I said that thing for the last 20 years, I was the crazy bitch that wasn't invited to the parties, because she will call out fulanito, ciclanito, and then the party will be over. And so, and now it's like everybody wants to come to my party, but like not talk to me. And so yeah, I just feel like we all, I just want to throw that out there. I'm very proud of everybody who's told their story, no matter what is acceptable by media and, you know, popular culture.
Ness, I saw your hand go up. I'm like, oh, it's your turn.
I just thank you for saying all of those things. It has been, and just to go off of like, oh, this like irritating idea, and then also existing, I like getting feedback from like people that are like famous, or people that have made, it's very strange and upsetting, especially when it's not who I'm targeting it as my readership. And like also being made feel like, oh, you made it, like this idea of like, you made it. And in my head, I'm just like, the first day I made a comic, I made it. I became a comic artist. I exist when I was born, I made it. I'm here. Like, this is, I do not understand this idea of like achieving something, or like the goal is to get the okay by the people who already had the okay. Like, it has been so fun. Like, I love everything that's happening right now. Like, I love being heard, and I love my friends being heard, and I love being seen, but there is like, yes, take care of yourself before anything else, because it is exhausting to talk about existing when you're just like trying to live. So thank you so much for saying all that. That just felt wonderful to hear.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me of a moment, like, I like, as much as like the politics, like existing as like BIPOC folk or POC, like cartoonists, like it's important, or like we feel the social obligation to make these stories, but sometimes like, ugh, I just love that we have the space to also like talk about our feelings, talk about what does it mean to cry and what does it mean to be sensitive, because I think we're also being sometimes pigeonholed to be strong like people. And I'm like, dude, I just want to like cry. I had like a zine one time when I was tabling at a show called Being Half Salvi, and the older like white dude like picks it up. He's like, "Hi, is this about the war?" And I'm like, "The Salvadoran Civil War is what you're talking about?" And I'm like, "No, this is about me crying. This is about me like not feeling connected to like like indigeneity and like African roots because of colonization." And I'm like, I'm just mourning, man. Like, let me just cry about this. And yeah, sometimes there's this expectation just in some way, like on our own accord. But I also love that so many of us are taking up the space to also just be emotional human beings, because I think that just, it's beautiful to see all of like our stories with so much nuance. And I think so many of our readership, especially people from our communities, absolutely need that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I really want an anthology that says, let me just cry. Like, I really think we all need that. So I want to open it up though to the Q&A, to the our amazing attendants who are, you know, videoing in digitally, virtually, you know, the matrix. So first question is, you know, if time, money was not an issue, what's one project you really want to tackle?
That's hard. I feel like as someone who's got like 42 ideas that they haven't written down, it's like it could be all of them once I write them. But I think actually maybe in this moment it's like just expanding on what I'm doing with the kind of like Spanglish comics poetry. Just the more singular zines I do, and kind of like the more I kind of link them together into mini series, the more I realize like, oh, I kind of want to make this into like a bigger project, like an anthology, a collection or something like that. But it's like, I already know my work is like very unusually received because it's like so abstract, especially even as like a memoir, with it being like so nonlinear. So it's just like one of those things where it's like, I'm going to keep making it, but I just don't know how, you know, kind of like move through those spaces aside from the spaces I already engage with. But it's like, yeah, if I could not have to worry about like money and sustaining myself, I would just make that giant book of all those like comic poems.
There's like one idea that I made like several years ago, like actually probably 2 years ago, in school, like a rom-com, like slice of life comic. That's something I want to do, but with like animal people, I guess, to kind of pay homage to Jim Davis. I don't know. I don't care what people say about Garfield. Like, I want to get back into the animal people comics too. Yeah, because I love manga. I kind of been wanting to do something like that, something within like that sort of approach to slice of life. Just like long-winded scenes of like, I don't know, tumbleweed like billowing, the wind, some kind of poetry happening in the back.
I've always done everything I do since I started my zines. I've just found ways to steal stuff or to just create it without spending money, or just getting an extra job to make it. Like my band is definitely funded by like extra jobs. And now I've been living off my art for a while, freelance illustration. But as far as my own personal projects, like the books I release and stuff, I don't know. I think being financially stable off of those things has never even been a concept because of the intersectionality. And like now I'm, super grateful for where tarot deck and like things that have become successful over the years. So when I hear that question, I get confused and I'm like, oh no, just get another job, do the thing, do the animal comic, just get that third job. But so I'm gonna think, I just want to say them like an expensive, weird thing I really want to do that seems I really want to get into murals. That seems so expensive and strange. And I work so small, like this is like, this is what I do. This is like, it's that size usually. And I just feel like, yeah, like just some really expensive giant thing. I also like film and like animation, like, but I don't like doing it, so I would want to hire someone and then I draw the characters and I'll like wear a sweater and I'll just watch over, and that's expensive because I'd have to hire a bunch of animators and I'll be the director, artist, writer, and I hate animating, y'all. If any of y'all want to do this project, I'll hire you when money's not an issue and I just have a bunch.
Nobody pays me for my comics, so I guess I am doing what I want to do, and I'm not actually concerned about money or time in general. I just did not grow up with that concept. But like, this story I would like to do, and I've been thinking about this, and it's so, I'm gonna do it, and no one's gonna like it, and it's gonna be fine, because it'll be for me, is to compare the show Felicity and the show Lost, because they're both written by J.J. Abrams, and they're literally the same show, and I need people to know this.
I've been seeing you talk about that on Twitter, and I'm like, I should get into the show, because I was binging Lost with my friends.
The project I want to do, if time and money was not an object, is like this like Hawaiian Western. It's a historical graphic novel that I wanted to do, but Westerns are like not popular in the graphic novel world or historical pieces. So it's like they're like, nah, every time I've tried to pitch it. But yeah, set in like the 1890s, right when like all these different cultures were immigrating there to try and like, make their money. So it'd be like a young Hawaiian girl, a young Shaolin monk, and like a disgraced Ronin, because those were all present in Hawaii at that time, and Portuguese cowboys, and it's like a huge like melding pot of people. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of like revisit that time, because it's also like just like not shown in media and hardly in our history books either, and just make it like really fun and like a classic Western, like adventure, like maybe some gunfights, and yeah, I would like to do that.
Thank you. So we're wrapping up. We're coming on the 2:30 mark. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. I'm going to put your URLs for your Instagrams. I know, I'm sorry, into the chat box here for everyone, so they can find you and follow you and buy your work and support you, so we can get those other pet projects into the universe. And so I just want to kind of, if you can just leave us with what do you hope, readers, what do you hope people take away from your work?
I hope they feel seen, or else if they don't feel seen, they at least get some insight into something that they've never experienced.
I hope that with everything I put into my stories, no matter like if they're goofy or very serious, as I really want people to understand that the idea of nuance and duality, and that this world is a gray and now smoky, but it is not black and white. So
I've always wanted for people to take in the stuff that I'm telling, the stories I'm telling, and use them for their own healing and their own survival, and their own motivation and inspiration to be a weirdo and be kind of whoever they want. Another intersection that isn't as politicized or about identity that troubles the industry on my end is that I'm really like gross and punk, and I like farting and being funny, and then sex, and I love sexuality that's gross and funny. But then I like very serious, deep narratives about family and healing and trauma. And so merging those two things is like awkward for a lot of audiences who like, you know, are trying to be serious for a minute, which I get. But at the same time, that's just so important to me to hold on to both of those things and to be like, you know, like Ren and Stimpy and Frida Kahlo together at last. And like, and so I want other people to take that in and be like, oh, like I like these two things that like don't really coexist, or three things or five. And I want to just, I want my art to embody all those things. So then I, you know, 10 years down the line, I don't feel like I silence this part of myself. Because it's very important to let every part of yourself shine when you're making art, and not just the parts that sell.
I think when I think about what I want people to take away from my work, I want them to feel comforted, like feel comforted in like being seen and things like that, and being heard, and like seeing their representation of like some part of them out there. Especially just thinking about whenever I'm talking specifically about like mental health and like anxiety and depression and things like that, and seeing people be able to like relate to the way in which I'm like visually describing that whole like feeling and situation you might find yourself in. Like being able to pick up a zine and like have that experience myself is like what inspires me and what has inspired me to make some of the comics that I've made. And it's just like, it is a really great sensation of warmth you have that just kind of like resonate. It's like when the Grinch's heart like grows like 2 sizes or whatever. It's like I want people to have that sensation, because whenever I have that, I'm just like, oh my god, this is so great. Like I'm just like, I'm feeling happy for the rest of the day, even if I might have been in this slump, because now it's like someone gets you, and that's just a really great thing to have.
Yeah, I love what's being said, like, and I resonate with everyone saying how everybody should have access to this form, to comics, because it is meant for everybody to enjoy, and that they feel like some semblance of healing and being seen. I hella feel that. I guess what I want to add is that you don't need to be like this bona fide professional artist with like a little like French beret, or like, you know, wearing my bowling shirt today because I really miss it. But like you could just make a comic about anything that you want, be it super mundane, being about making breakfast, about something that you're reacting to, whether that be on a political level or just like socially or inwardly. There's space for you. There will always be space for you to join in the party. Like, I just love being a weirdo too, and it's just a bunch of freaks that are part of this community. And especially if you identify as like BIPOC, person of color, like will have people who want to see you thrive and to feel held. So yeah, come on in to this side of the pool.
Thank you. That, I think, is a perfect, lovely note to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for all tuning in. And so get ready for the next expo panel, which is Sustaining the Momentum, Comics and DIY Culture.